Okay, so my name's Cindy Payne. I'm the leader of the tech consulting group at Nationwide, which is part of a shared services organization, and we focus on software development across Nationwide IT. We support business units such as where Jim lives, or works. So the context about Nationwide IT right now is we're in the midst of a significant transformation with a lot of focus around building speed within and capability within our company. These transformational changes are bringing a lot of change for our coworkers, and Jim and I, as leaders and change agents, really spend our energy and focus trying to find ways to help those impacted by the changes we're making own the changes and feel like they're part of them and somewhat in control versus having the change happen to them. In addition, we put a lot of energy around finding ways to help Nationwide actually speed up and be able to accelerate the pace that we can absorb change. So this talk specifically is about our GitHub conversion, which we think is a great model for embracing those things that I just discussed. So we focused on empowering our associates to take control of the changes that were happening, and we're trying to accelerate Nationwide's ability to react to change. Just tying in with the keynote speaker today, when Jason was talking about how hard it is for large enterprises to change out their tools because they impact so many users, I really think that that's an old story that we have to change, just like integration used to be hard before we did continuous integration, just like releases used to be big and difficult before we did continuous deployments. Large enterprises need to be able to change as rapidly without the pain that we used to have. So that's our focus, and that's what our talk will be about.
So a bit about Nationwide. I'm sure everybody's seen the Payne Manning commercials. You know what we do. But the message here is that A, we're big, and when we do something like GitHub, we tend to do it big, big bang for the entire organization. Also, from a business standpoint, we're way more than just auto insurance. We're number one in a bunch of things. We're number one in pet insurance. We're number one in farm insurance, number one in corporate life. We're also very big in retirement plans. So the breadth is quite big. We've also been around for a while. We're about 90 years old, and we are a mutual company. So we are not publicly traded, which brings some advantages, at least for us, because we can take more longer-term strategic decision-making versus having to satisfy quarterly results. We're also a fantastic place to work for. Fortune 100 best places to work for the past 2 or 3 years, 3 years now, I believe. And we're number 68 on the Fortune 500 list.
Okay, so then a little bit about Nationwide IT, also large organization, 5,100 IT associates. The way we work is we work in what we call agile teams. There's 200 of them, most of them doing anything from custom development to package applications to legacy COBOL, and then we do a ton of, for example, data provisioning. We have 23 different business units. Those are internally and externally facing business units. Of the 5,100 IT associates, about 2,600 of those are developers and testers. And then we have this count of applications, so 2,500 applications. This is definitely pre-microservice numbers, but these are deployable artifacts that we keep track of. So it's a fairly large environment, and if I go back to the 200 lines, those lines work on 50 different primary technologies. And specifically, my shared services organization helps usher in new technologies to those lines when that happens. One of the things that's nice being in the position that I'm in is seeing the perspective of how different technologies change the developer experience. So of course, we have traditional Java, .NET development, and scripting languages and what you're all familiar with. But we just have a ton of packaged applications at Nationwide as well. And we're getting into a lot of newer technologies that are automating and taking away what you would normally see developers do, as we heard yesterday, and they aren't doing a lot of coding. But I'll tell you that the packages that we're seeing, specifically like around RPA, robotic process automation, is they really lose the engineering aspect of writing code. So it's not just taking away the code, but it's kind of going backwards in terms of it's hard to even have anything to version control or to collaborate on, and it's very single-threaded. So I will say that although I see this trend in, how much will developers be actually developing, writing code in the future, I see that happening. I also see a huge opportunity for helping the companies that are making these frameworks and tools to inject engineering principles still, so that you can have multiple people working on the same thing and still collaborate and still what we would call merge. These kind of things are impossible in some of these packages that we're seeing. So that's just an observation. So the business case around the GitHub, even acquiring GitHub for Nationwide, was pretty difficult. It was hard to quantify, but in the end it came down to developer productivity is how we sold it. If you want the details of how we did our business case, we weren't going to go into that now, but you can feel free to talk to us after the talk. We'd be happy to share our secrets. But what it got down to was there was a significant investment in order to bring GitHub into Nationwide, since we'd been using Subversion at a pretty low cost internally. So what we really needed to do is we needed to eliminate any costs associated with converting. So all the investments made in the actual product itself and not in trying to get to there. The other aspect that we wanted to minimize is we wanted to eliminate the bubble costs of having Subversion, support, and infrastructure in place while we were adopting GitHub. So for a company like ours, we took on a pretty aggressive schedule of 1 year, and we proposed that we do it without any large IT project to avoid the overhead.
So we're going to go through kind of how we accomplished that in the less than 1 year target to convert everybody. But from a technology standpoint, you heard Cindy mention Subversion. Yes, we were an extremely heavy user of Subversion. The majority of our code was on Subversion. It was actually a big success story 8+ years ago because we got everybody using a single code repository. And actually, to further complicate things, we also have some users still in Harvest, which is a 20+-year-old technology that does version control as well as some software development workflow aspects. So our scope was to retire both of those and move everything over that Nationwide has source code-wise to GitHub. Cindy mentioned that we really had no capacity for a centralized team, so that was one of our constraints to do these conversions. And then the last one was an interesting one, an interesting discovery is Nationwide, I'm sure like other large enterprises, have a chargeback model for using shared services, internal chargeback model for using shared services or people. And the way that we charged back for Subversion was we charged the business units for each repository that they used. So of course, developers were creative and put everything in one repository for their organization because they only had to pay for the one. But what it did for us is we didn't know what our breadth was. In my area, we had one Subversion repository that actually turned out to be 100 GitHub repositories once we divided things up the way they should have been initially. So just another complexity. It was hard for us to tell when done would be done. Okay, so this GitHub conversion was really part of a much larger DevOps journey that Nationwide's on. And we realized early on that GitHub was going to be foundational for us to start that DevOps journey. And because it was foundational, we really wanted to lay down some guiding principles that we could all look back to for this project or for this initiative. And those are the three right here. So open and searchable, one organization, and self-service. We'll go into details on each one of these coming up. So open and searchable. But to make it simple, all repositories in GitHub had to be readable by default. This may seem obvious, but for us, it was actually a big cultural shift. We had many developers or testers that were very used to living in a bubble and not letting other people see the code that they wrote or even have that code available for review. So definitely a big shift culturally for us as well as just the technology shift. To drive that home, we set some guardrails of why a repository would need to be private. And there's really only two reasons. One is we had a lot of legacy applications that still had things like passwords embedded within either the code or property files within the code, and they weren't abstracted out. So if you had credentials in your code, you got to be private, but it wasn't a hall pass. You had to put together a plan to make your repository public. And then the other reason that you would make it private is sometimes Nationwide would have I'll call it a secret project that was maybe tied to a marketing launch or a new product launch, and a limited audience needed to know about it for a small period of time. But once it was publicly announced, then we would flip the repository to public. So those are only really the two reasons that a repository in GitHub's, or Nationwide's GitHub instance would be private. The other thing is, at least for us in a highly regulated industry, is don't underestimate IRM and our security folks and our legal team's opinions of what we were doing. There was some heartburn, and maybe still is, about making things open and searchable across the organization, but the benefits we're seeing are fantastic. So, it was nice. We had some recent potential security vulnerabilities, and in the past, we really had no way to assess our impact. If there was a vulnerability in some library, it was a lot of human work to identify, if we were susceptible. Now that everything's in GitHub, we were able to actually show our security folks, hey, I can search for this version, for this library, and see exactly where in the enterprise that we were vulnerable. That's it right there. So one organization. This one is probably the one we spent the most time on. Cindy mentioned the 23 business units that we have. There was a bias initially to organize our code in 23 organizations inside of GitHub Enterprise. After consulting actually with some of our GitHub reps, we really pushed for one organization and a flat structure across that. This has really helped us on our inner sourcing journey. The 200 lines that Cindy mentioned often bounce around between different lines of business. If we wouldn't have chosen one organization, they would have had to been reset up with different permissions in each one of those organizations. And it really helps promote this sharing and making knowledge viral. We had no discoverability before this. I didn't know that the team across the street was writing the same login widget that I was, because it wasn't discoverable. They were in a different Subversion repository in that case. And then if that makes you nervous, if you have a large company like ours of 5,000 or so developers, having one flat structure, if that makes you nervous, the topics feature that was recently released has really helped us, because now we've been able to tag repos by maybe line of business or technology or the applications that it supports. So you do get that granular indexing that you would have gotten if we would have organized in silos. I like numbers, so I put numbers up. So we're about 9-10 months into this migration, and we got a ton of volume already. We've moved 2,600 repositories. About 12,000 pull requests have occurred so far, around 2,900 users and over 500 teams. The interesting part is those 2,900 users is more than the number of developers and testers that we had on the previous slide. And it's really because GitHub has removed all the friction around version control for us. And now we're seeing people like our infrastructure folks version control some of their configuration. We're seeing our DBAs version control their scripts. And then, as we move, Cindy mentioned packaged apps, we're seeing business users using version control for things like Salesforce configurations.
Okay, so the third guiding principle is self-service, and the one that I really love because it's enabled easily by GitHub, but it's one that going forward, it's my standard, the bar that for any other tool is I look to, is this something that's been built in a way that a company like Nationwide can roll out in a self-service model like we were able to do with GitHub. So it's all about the product being built in the right way that enables teams to be able to stay secure but still do it themselves. And that really starts with administration. And that was a huge bottleneck in Subversion and for most of the other enterprise tools that we roll out, which is just getting access to the tool, getting into the tool, getting the access privileges that you need. These are all wait states. They're all manual processes with 3-day SLAs, and it causes productivity problems. But more than that, it causes friction to using the tools. People will avoid them even for the slightest inconvenience. So what we did was, because we have one org, and of course nothing much happens if you log into GitHub without being assigned an organization, we built customization. This is the kind of stuff that our quote-unquote project team, which is not much of anybody because we actually use the community to build all of the stuff we're talking about, is we auto-add people to the organization as soon as they log in. And then from that point on, they can create repositories, they can create teams, add people, do everything. So this has created, going back to the regulatory issues that Jim mentioned, this has created some nervousness, especially auditing and legal reasons. And we say, no, really the people that are administering the teams now actually know better than anybody else who should be part of their teams. Having it be a centralized administration made no sense because it went through a process where nobody in the process actually knew what code base people really needed access to. So, so if you don't, trust the people, you can still verify. GitHub APIs and reporting let you verify who's on what team. We have ways to cross-check it. So just trust the system, trust the self-service administration, and then run reports from an auditing standpoint if you think that there's problems. And then finally, we had to develop fit-for-purpose guides. We have some other places where we have collaboration tools, places where documents go to die, as Jim says, in places like SharePoint. And people were, when you do self-service, people, associates could potentially get confused on what goes in GitHub and what goes in these other tools. And so we just had to be really clear about when to use one versus the other. And then finally, we had to put in a policy about credentials in code. So these are the kind of things that satisfy our legal department, is if we say specifically, here's the right way to handle credentials in code, here's the wrong way, and then from that point on, they trust that we've trained and put out a policy that's easy to follow, and that all the things that they used to handle through these wait states are now taken care of. So dormant users is another thing that we automated. GitHub's great because they encourage you to aggressively manage your dormant users, which means that your licensing fees don't get bloated, which we really appreciate. But what we found out is when you suspend those dormant users and they want to come back in, because sometimes they do, that process again was introducing the wait state. So we did build some customization where we not only auto-suspend people when they haven't used GitHub in a while, but we also, when they come back in, can unsuspend them, and they don't see the difference. So conversion is probably the most exciting thing that I like to talk about because we did it all with community support. So these were practitioners, developers on the lines. The first lines actually built the conversion utility, made it an inner-sourcing project that other developers, as they came and used it, either corrected defects or enhanced to handle things like migrating users and teams over, and handling scale. So for example, Jim had 100 repositories that needed moved over with 8 years of history, and that was taking like 8 days on somebody's laptop. And so they contributed, how do we just scale that up using Docker and let it go in less than an hour. So all of that conversion, so we started with an open source piece of code, but built all of those other scenarios that were important to our user base through this self-service utility. So we have instructions on GitHub, here's how you use it, here's if you run into trouble, here's the community that can help you get over that. And then of course, if you find deficiencies in it, you can contribute back. And finally, the training is all community-based too. So we have a strong learning culture at Nationwide. We have something a couple times a month called Teaching Thursdays. Nationwiders teach each other what they know. And so we use that model for this. And so pretty much every Teaching Thursday, there's a session on GitHub, whether it's basic, advanced, and we also do a pairing session. So if anybody's having trouble just even getting started, they can come and pair with somebody during those sessions and kind of have one-on-one training.
So that's kind of the guiding principles for the conversion, but then it became time to actually do the rollout, and we really needed a strategy around that. And our mantra there was removing friction. So I mentioned that we had this internal chargeback model for Subversion that you paid per repository. That obviously wouldn't work when the 1 became 100 with GitHub. So then the next choice is, okay, GitHub is licensed by user. Maybe we charge back by user. Same problem. It encourages the wrong behavior and people will not do the right thing. So we came to a solution here of prepaying for our licenses and then spreading them across the top of the house so that individual business units didn't see the quote unquote pain of using GitHub. The other thing is we didn't want to do any reporting. Like we have repositories that need to move from Subversion to GitHub, and reporting on that was important from a metric standpoint for our senior leadership and project managers, but we didn't want to spend our time there. So we built Splunk dashboards for everything, and you'll see an example of one on the next slide. But really, it's using Splunk to look at SVN logs, look at GitHub logs, look at GitHub's API, and automate all the important numbers that we care about. So we know exactly where we are on our journey. And then Cindy mentioned the community-based support model. There's lots of forums for people to come in and get help. So hands-on keyboards, let's sit for a couple hours and work on your conversion. Because we have areas at Nationwide that didn't even have consistent branching and merging strategies. So everyone kind of needed their own special help to get the conversion working for them.
So this is our example of the Splunk dashboard that we built, which I love because as a leader of this GitHub conversion, I do care about that we finish and that we finish this year and hit our goals. So I want to track that, but I want to do it with the minimal amount of effort. And so we decided that a 2-week window was the right window to watch for trends on whether we were seeing repositories going away in Subversion and increasing in GitHub. Our definition of done when you're converted is that you turn your repository to read-only, and the dashboard picks that up and considers that a migrated or converted repository. The other things we track are specifically every Subversion activity so that we can actually see who are the people that are still using it heavily and don't appear to be moving or moving on their own. And those are where we put our whole focus. So when we look at this dashboard, there's one that sticks out at the top, and they're the largest user of Subversion. And from day one, we could see that, and that's where we've spent all our focus saying, are they having trouble moving? Is there anything we can do to help them, bring them into the, not create a new system for them, but to bring them into the system that we've built around self-service and self-conversion, and just help them through the process. So we get a lot of detail here, and this is pretty much what we rely on to say, are we successful or are we on track? Pretty simple. And finally, the last thing we wanted to talk about was so of course we wanted to activate the adoption of GitHub and the migration from Subversion or other tools into GitHub, but we've seen an incredible amount of value that we're getting from it, where it's not part of even our efforts to push these things, but it's just the GitHub as a product, and its features are so intuitive, and I'll say hit the spot with the developers that they have picked them up and started using these features. So GitHub Pages is a perfect example of almost immediately there started growing, I'd say, knowledge bases where developers across these 200 lines are contributing best practices and accelerators, things that they've built that make them faster, and they want to share it with other people. And they've housed all this information and published it in GitHub Pages. And that was without any promotion of our team in telling them that that was available or that they should do that. So that's created a great environment for inner sourcing. So it kind of started with inner sourcing around knowledge, and now has grown in all of those, what I called accelerators, prepackaged frameworks code, thing that's make people, developers faster. Those are now all being inner sourced within Nationwide. And so we keep seeing this momentum around people understanding that the value, what Jim said, is when everything's open and discoverable, that you can not only use it, but you can contribute to it, and it completely changes the culture of coding at Nationwide. Analytics, this is it's so small, but it's such a big deal at Nationwide, where we finally have these 200 lines all together that we can see, but finding out, for example, what is the primary technology that those lines work in actually requires us stopping somebody on that line and asking them that question. So just being able to see the language of a repository in GitHub has provided just the minimal analytics ability where we can stop asking our teams and interrupting from development in order to get what we need to manage the large workforce. So one of the things I'd really love to see in the analytics space, and I talk to our sales rep all the time about this, which is we really want to see at the commit level what the technology is that commits in, because we really want to get a picture of our 2,600 IT developers and testers, and even our business users now that are coding. They code in Salesforce. They do our user experience team. There's all kinds of business users that have needs for version control. But what we'd really love to see is across everybody using GitHub, what are their technical skills? So being able to say, I know there's 2,000 people at Nationwide that know how to code in JavaScript, or be able to look at a single developer and say, I know that developer knows how to code in 10 different languages. That's huge and powerful for a workforce the size of 5,100 IT associates. So that's the direction I'd like to see the analytics capabilities go for enterprise support. But what they have already has been very valuable. And finally, something as simple as a wiki. We actually didn't have any platform at Nationwide for developers to document how to work in their code base. It's a little crazy, but it was true. So most of them put things in Word documents and put them on SharePoint, which I don't think I have to explain to anybody the problem with that. But as soon as they started converting, not only did they make their conversion, but almost immediately they started migrating all of their documentation into the wikis, and that grew naturally. So that's really our story about our conversion. And
yes, thanks for coming. We'll hang out after if you guys have any questions, but thank you.